Well, it looks like we have a few more people online now, so let's get underway with the main content for our webinar. So good morning and welcome everyone. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name's Lynn Lavery. I'm the Director of Academic Consulting, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing some of my favourite writing tips with you over the next hour. Now, in terms of what I'll be covering today, I'll begin by discussing some tips for getting started with your writing. One of the biggest issues I find academics and postgrad students have is actually just finding time to write. So I'll quickly cover a few tips at the beginning of the session that I hope might assist with that. I'll then talk about some of my favourite writing strategies, including some tips for beating writer's block. And to finish off, I'll discuss a few tips around the technical side of writing, such as using a style sheet and some suggested tools for writing also. Now, I'm very much hoping that at the end we will have some time for questions. That does depend a little bit on how many questions come through during the course of the webinar. But do be thinking about, as I present these tips, if you have any questions about writing that you'd like to ask, then we should hopefully have some time for those at the end. And I may be able to incorporate those at a few stages along the way as well. So if at any stage you have a question, I would really encourage you to send that through. Now, it would be really helpful for me to know who we have online today in terms of what you're writing and what your experience is with writing. So I'm just going to very quickly launch a poll on screen. And I'd love to know what your current piece of writing is. I'm assuming everyone is writing something currently, and hence why you're attending today. Now, I have allowed you to enter multiple options there. I'm aware that we often have a few pieces of writing on the go at any one time. So pop through your option in terms of what best describes the current piece of writing that you're working on. I'll just leave that open for a few more seconds. We've got almost all the group has responded. And thanks to those of you that are sending messages through the question panel if you've got something else. Okay, I might just close that and I will share it with you all. I do like to give people an idea as to who else is online with them. So we've got just over half of you are working on a thesis, just under half working on a journal article, with a smaller group working on research proposals. Wonderful. Thank you for that, folks. My other quick question for you, just bring another poll up, and once again I have allowed multiple options here. I'd love to know what your main challenges are when you are writing. So is it actually finding the time to write? Do you struggle with writer's block? Do you have an issue, which I often have myself, where you want your writing to be perfect? Is it around forming a well-structured logical argument, or is it more technical issues? Now, unfortunately, GoToWebinar only allows me 5 options. I probably could have filled out about 20 there. So if you have a different writing challenge to the ones that I have on screen, send that through to me via the control panel. So if your main challenge is not in the poll, let me know what it is. Gosh, I think I was pretty spot on with the challenges I selected. The responses coming through thick and fast. Okay, that's been up a minute, so I'm just going to close that, and actually everyone has responded. So, perfectionism, that is quite a biggie by the looks of it. So 68% of you have an issue with wanting your writing to be perfect, but that is followed pretty closely by finding time to write and forming a well-structured logical argument. So the good news is all of those are topics I will be covering over the course of today's webinar. If you did have another challenge that wasn't listed, as I say, you're welcome to send that through, and it might be I get a chance to cover that as well. But it looks like in terms of today's content, I was pretty spot on figuring out what challenges you may be having. Now, just a note before I get started on my tip slides, I will be going through some of the topics quite quickly because I want to get through as many tips as possible. And as I mentioned, I'm also hoping to have time for questions. If you find yourself wishing there was a pause or rewind button at any point, I can't offer you that in the live session, but I am recording today's webinar, and assuming technology goes to plan, you'll receive a copy of the recording later today. So that will mean that you can review anything that you'd like to from the session. Well, finding time to write was a problem for just over half of you. And I think one of the reasons we find it so challenging to find time to write is that we don't necessarily plan ahead for it. So I'm going to talk about some strategies to solve, or hopefully solve, that problem. Now, while my first tip is about goal setting, I also want to acknowledge that goals don't work for everyone. So if you are the kind of person that knows goals just don't work for you, do feel free to ignore my first piece of advice today. Having said that, of course, it might just be that you're not setting goals in the right way. A well-set goal can drive you forward, help you with focus to get where you need to be, and keep you motivated and enthusiastic. A badly set goal is hard to reach, or even to know if you've reached it at all, and more importantly, it's often demotivating, which defeats the whole purpose of setting a goal in the first place. Now, ideally, a writing goal needs to be SMART. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of SMART goals, I'd suggest doing a quick Google search after the webinar today. But just in brief, SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Now, in relation to writing, I think the keywords there are specific and achievable. So let's just take a look at a couple of writing goals. The first one is I will write every day. The second one is I will spend a minimum of 20 minutes writing each weekday, working towards a first draft of my journal article. Now, that first goal is a tad vague for my liking. How long will you write for? What will you be writing? What's the ultimate goal? The second one is much more specific. It states how long you'll write for and for what purpose. I also really like the fact that it states minimum of 20 minutes. Not only is that achievable, but I find personally if I aim to do 20 minutes, I usually actually keep writing once I have got underway. Now, speaking of achievable, it is really, really important that whatever goal you set yourself can actually be achieved. So just to talk about how that might go wrong, by way of example, if you have the kind of schedule where things tend to be a little bit all over the place with interruptions and unexpected events, saying you're going to write every day may not be doable. It might not be achievable. Saying that you'll write for half an hour, 5 days each week, just means you've got a little bit more flexibility. So if something goes wrong one day, you can always catch up on your writing on another. Now, my second tip, there's not much point writing a huge number of words if they aren't moving you towards a larger goal, such as getting published or finishing a thesis. And this is an issue I see time and time again with the researchers that I speak to. They've written thousands of words on a particular topic, only to discover that they've exceeded the word count of the journal they want to submit to, or that they've gone on lots and lots of side tangents and actually failed to address the main problem at hand. I'm a huge fan of always writing with a purpose. I don't like wasting time. So I have a couple of tips for this. First of all, if you're completing a piece of writing based on research, do keep your research question in plain sight while you work. That will help keep you on track and stop you going down rabbit holes. That was one of the many hard lessons I learned as a master's student. My thesis for my master's was on the friendships of children with ADHD. And I remember sending what I thought was the final draft of my lit review to my supervisor. I had written a lengthy section on the friendships of children. I had another really long section on ADHD, how you diagnose it, what the characteristics are, etc. And I very proudly presented that to my supervisor, who pretty much put a red pen through most of it. So I was a tad horrified, but I found the feedback he gave me at the time incredibly helpful. He said, "Look, Lynn, it's really, really well written, but your research is about the friendships of children with ADHD. You've actually got very little on that particular topic." So I always think of that when I write now. Your writing needs to be very, very focused and relate clearly to your research question. And for me, having my research question on the wall above where I'm writing definitely helps with that. It's funny, it's one of those things we always think we're going to remember, but when we get bogged down in detail and we're drowning in data, it is really easy to lose sight of that main research question. Now, my second tip for this slide is to sketch an outline for the piece of writing you're about to tackle. An outline can help you focus before you get started, can help to structure your ideas, and also identify any gaps there might be in your analysis or understanding. Now, your outline can just be a written one, but if you are more of a visual person, a great way to create an outline is to create a mind map. And so I've listed a couple of mind mapping applications at the end of the slides today. My two favourites are Xmind and Inspiration, but there certainly are others. And I find both of those are really helpful for creating a visual map that I can then convert into an outline. For me, I think because I am such a visual person, it just means that doing a map first is a really nice place to start. I use mind mapping to map out pretty much all of my chapters for my PhD. Found it really helpful. But another nice strategy relating to outlining, if you don't like the idea of mind mapping, is to plan your writing as a talk first, even if it's just a talk that you'd be giving to yourself. Now, if you have all your main slides as the main points of your talk, then it means you can turn each PowerPoint slide into a section or paragraph, and that way you've got an instant outline. Now, having a writing routine can be really, really helpful to help you form healthy writing habits. So try writing at the same time every day, for example. Doesn't matter what time of day it is, just pick a time that works best for you, and that should hopefully help you create a habit that will mean it's much, much easier for you to get started at each writing session. Other ideas for routines, you might have a specific environment that you always work in. You might have a writer at work sign that you put up on your office door, or a particular coffee cup that you drink out of when you're writing. Now, if you're not convinced of the usefulness of having a routine, I'm going to ask you all a couple of questions, and I am going to get you to use that raise hand button on the control panel for this. So grab your mouse and have a look for the raise hand button. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. So who amongst you has ever set a New Year's resolution to implement something new and then failed to meet the resolution? So who's broken their New Year's resolutions? Use that raise hand button. Okay, so I've got pretty much everyone's hands in the group is going up there. Fab. Let's put all the hands down. So my next question, who has tried to start a new behaviour like going to the gym or starting a new diet and ended up saying partway through the week, oh blast, I'll just start all over again on Monday? So put your hand up if that's applied to you. So you're doing something out of your normal routine and you haven't managed to stick to it. Once again, we've got everyone's hands going up, or almost everyone. I'll pop those down again. Now, my third question, who forgot to brush their teeth this morning? So as I thought, we don't have any hands going up for that one, or at least no one wants to own up to it. So it's interesting, isn't it? When we have something that is a habit, it's a routine, we just do it without thinking. But anything out of the ordinary, like going to the gym or starting a new diet, is much, much harder to implement. So the trick is in the early stages of establishing your writing routine to persevere with it until it becomes that habit, like brushing your teeth. It's amazing how much easier your writing will be if you just are in that routine of it. Thanks for participating in that, everyone. Now, I do have a couple other suggestions for routines. One thing I like to do is having a particular playlist that I use to help me focus. And I highly recommend an app called Focus at Will if you are the kind of person that works well with music. Over time, that app learns what types of music improve your productivity. Now, I always use Focus at Will when I write. I actually prepared today's webinar using Focus at Will. So if you are interested in having a look at that, there is a link for it at the end of my slides today. Writing with others is also a surprisingly effective routine. You might have heard of Shut Up and Write groups, which is when a group get together in a cafe or another meeting area and they sit and write for a set period of time. Likewise, if your university runs writing retreats, do try and get yourself along to one. Obviously, that will take you out of your usual routine, but it is always nice to connect with other people that are engaged in the same task as you. Now, just a tip to add to my Focus at Will tip, I've had a message through from one of the group, Wendy, who says that Brain.fm is really great as well. So there's a couple suggestions for you for some writing music. Now, my last tip around planning for writing is to block out time for it to happen. Now, a really nice strategy for that is to make a meeting with yourself. Now, if you had a meeting with a colleague, you would turn up on time and you'd make sure your phone and email were off so that you could focus on the task at hand. So why not treat your writing time with the same respect? Now, an added advantage of that strategy is that if someone asks you to do something else in that time slot, you can genuinely say to them, I'm terribly sorry, but I actually already have a meeting at that time. Now, in terms of when you make those time blocks, I've just talked about having a routine. So as part of that, do think about when you are likely to work best and when you're least likely to get interrupted. I'm a bit of an early bird, so I tend to write from 7 to 9 each day. That's also when I'm least likely to be interrupted. My colleagues at AC are usually in at the office at that time, but we're all focused on productive work, and so we don't tend to interrupt each other. Most of our clients usually aren't at their desk till a bit later in the day, so if I write in that 7 to 9 a.m. slot, I'm not likely to get flooded with phone calls and emails. Now, in contrast, getting me to write something at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is a complete waste of time. So I definitely try and avoid needing to write in that time slot. That's also when I'm most likely to get interrupted. Now, with those time blocks, also have a think about how long you want to write for. I know some writers that can write for a full day and others that are very productive just in 2-hour blocks. For me personally, I tend to work most productively in shorter chunks, so I use something called the Pomodoro technique. Now, looking at the names on the list, I think some of you have heard me talk about this before. Just for those of you that haven't heard me mention it or haven't heard of it before, the Pomodoro technique is based on those tomato-shaped oven timers that you've probably seen before. Pomodoro is Italian for tomato. The idea is that you set a timer for 25 minutes and you work uninterrupted for that time. So you turn your phone, email, social media off, and you just focus. After 25 minutes, you take a 5-minute break and do something different. You stretch, get a cup of tea, walk around the office, for example, and then you start another 25-minute block. The people that developed the technique suggest that for every 4 Pomodoros you complete, you take a longer break. For me personally, I actually find I need that longer break after just 3 25-minute blocks. There are a few things that I really like about that Pomodoro technique. One is that you start to learn how long things take you. We have a tendency to underestimate the amount of time a task will take, but you start to get better at that when you chunk things into 25-minute blocks. Second reason I like it is research consistently shows that regular breaks improve performance, but we can be quite bad at taking breaks. So that technique, having a timer go off every 25 minutes, is a really nice reminder of that. Okay, so they are a bunch of tips around planning for writing and being purposeful when you write. I've been delighted to see that as I've been talking, people have been sending me some tips of their own to share with the group, and some of them are excellent. So what I might just do at the very end, I'll go through and just share quickly with you all some of the tips that have come through from the group. Because as I say, some of them are quite neat. Well, my first tip around writing strategies is quite a good technique for overcoming writer's block if you have it. So it's around free writing. And if that's not something that you've heard of, it's basically just putting anything down on the page that comes to mind, sometimes called fast or process writing. Now, it might be rubbish that you write down, but that's okay because free writing is actually just for you. So you might write things like, gosh, I really don't understand this concept. I'm not really sure what I'm writing about here, etc., etc. Beginning with nonsense like that is actually just a starting point. And you often find that if you keep writing, your ideas start becoming clearer the more you write. Now, the trick to successful free writing is not to edit as you go. So you just actually need to write. Now, given the very high percentage of perfectionists we had in today's group from my earlier poll, a little bit of a tip if you think that you will struggle with that. Instead of doing your free writing on paper, where you might be tempted to correct things and cross things out, do your free writing on a computer and turn the monitor off so that you can't see what you're typing. So that is a very effective free writing technique if you do have perfectionist tendencies. Now, some of you might be wondering about that strange acronym I've got on my slide as well, the WORMI technique. Now, WORMI stands for What I Really Mean Is. So it's quite similar to free writing, but here you're actually using that sentence starter of what I really mean is, and then you just keep writing. So it is a nice way to begin writing as a bit of a warm-up because you do have something to start with. And it tends to be most useful if you are writing around a specific concept. Now, speaking of perfectionism, so we've clearly got quite a number of you in the group who have a tendency towards perfectionism. So I have a little bit of a motto for you to keep for yourselves. Don't get it right, get it written. So this is one of my favourite pieces of advice. It's from a colleague of mine from Auckland University. If you are trying to be a perfectionist on your drafts as you go through, it will be very, very difficult to get your writing completed. Now, one of my favourite techniques, because I am a perfectionist myself, and this is a technique I learnt from my colleague Rachel Butler. When I'm drafting, if there is a word or phrase that I'm not happy with, rather than sitting agonising over a different way to put it, I write it down and then I just highlight the text. So it means I just get it down on the page. I don't get it right, I get it written. Then when I finish my writing and I'm at the stage of reviewing and editing, I go back through all of the sections of text that are highlighted. Hopefully the whole document isn't highlighted. And when I review the highlighted sections, often by that stage I know exactly how I want to phrase it. And in fact, what I often find when I go back through those highlights, I realize that there's nothing wrong with the way I put it in the first place. But using that highlighting technique just allows me to move on and get my work completed. Now, if you're a perfectionist at the revising and editing stages, that strategy may not help you so much. But for those of you that have issues with perfectionism while you're drafting, I highly recommend that technique. Just get the words down, highlight them to come back to them later, and you can then review at a later stage. My next writing strategy is around parking downhill. There is nothing worse than picking up a piece of writing that you were really struggling with the previous day. So my next suggestion is that you always park downhill. Now that refers to the idea that it's best to leave your writing at a point where it's really easy to pick back up again next time. So it's based on the idea that if you have an unreliable car, it's always best to park downhill in the hope that that will get the engine started the next day. Now, I learned that technique from a colleague who apparently had a very unreliable car when she was completing her master's thesis. So she used the parking downhill strategy for both her thesis and the car. Now, sometimes perfectionism can cause writer's block, and a number of the tips I've covered so far today will hopefully help you out with writer's block. So the parking downhill strategy I just mentioned, free writing, having a writing routine, they're all examples of strategies that will help if you experience writer's block. In terms of other strategies, I think it's really important to know what works best for you personally and perhaps what's even causing the writer's block. I think it's actually a really complex issue, and what works for your colleague down the hall in respect to this won't necessarily work for you personally. And it's interesting, when I was talking about perfectionism with writing, I had a comment through from one of the group to say that for her, perfectionism has more to do with how sound her thinking is rather than how stylish her writing is. So I think that's a really interesting comment, that we can experience perfectionism in lots of different ways. It's a very individual thing. And in terms of strategies to deal with it, you do need to have a think about what the issue is and what will work best for it. Just a tip though, if you do have issues around perfectionism with your thinking, having a talk to another person is a really nice sort of strategy around that, whether that's a postgraduate supervisor or a colleague. I talked a lot to my cat when I did my PhD. I think my cat knew more about my topic than I did. So, you know, either bouncing ideas off someone or just hearing your thinking out loud can sort of help you get a little bit more confidence in your thinking. But coming back to writer's block, in addition to the strategies that I've already mentioned, you might want to think about taking a break, particularly if that break involves going for a walk and getting some fresh air. I often find that really works for me, just getting some movement and having a change of scene. Likewise, just a complete change in environment can be helpful. So just picking your laptop up and going to your favourite coffee shop for a couple of hours, that change in environment can really help shift your thinking. And also, often writer's block is to do with distractions in your environment. So just having a think. I talked earlier about having your phone and email and social media off. I had a tip actually through from one of the group earlier about that, just mentioning that airplane mode is a great strategy for that, just making sure your phone's not going to distract you. But there may well be other distractions in the environment as well. So just having a think about, you know, what's taking you away from your writing. Now, my two favourite strategies for dealing with writer's block. The first relates to what I was just saying before in relation to perfectionism around thinking, actually. I like to talk to a colleague, especially if my writer's block is related to my data analysis. I often find that talking it through with another person can clarify my thinking. And my second favourite strategy is to make a start on writing something easy. So I find for me personally, I sometimes just need to get myself started with writing. Once I'm in the swing of it, I'm good to keep going. So I might write up a section of my method or maybe some more descriptive findings that I've got just to get me underway. Now, my last tip around writer's block is to not delay starting writing. Writing is often something we like to procrastinate over. We claim that we need to be in the right frame of mind, or we say we're not ready to write. Let's have a quick show of hands on that one. Who finds themselves making statements like that? I'm not in the right frame of mind, or I'm not ready to write. Yeah, I thought there might be a few hands going up. It's interesting. Well, if you find yourself constantly delaying writing like that, have a good think about what the problem might be and put some strategies in place to get yourself started. Maybe some of the ones I've suggested in today's webinar. Delaying writing was something that spectacularly backfired on me when I was working on my PhD, which there was a certain irony around. So one of the first pieces of research I conducted as an academic was around strategies for thesis writing. We spoke to students who had just submitted a thesis and we asked what advice they would give to other students. And one of the main strategies they recommended was to write from day one and continue writing throughout, sort of building up your writing muscles, so to speak. Now, for some mad reason, I completely failed to follow that advice myself, and I ended up with horrendous writer's block when I was in the final stages of writing up my thesis. It's certainly not a mistake I've repeated as a result of that experience. So I'm constantly writing throughout any piece of research, even if it's just rough memos about my data analysis. I think any writing is a really great way to build up that writing muscle. Now I'll move on to my last section for today, but just a reminder, folks, that if as I'm talking you think of a tip of your own that you would like to share with the group, do send those through. I can see some coming through as I'm talking, as I said before. So keep sending them through, and likewise if you have any questions, do send those through during this final section as well. So my next set of slides mostly relate to techniques that are useful in relation to revising your work once it's actually written, but some of them might be helpful while you're in the drafting stages as well. So some of you may have heard of having a style sheet, which is basically something that can help you avoid inconsistencies in your writing, and it's also a massive time saver. Now, if you haven't heard of style sheets before, it's pretty much a set of rules that you follow for your own writing. So it's personal to you. You decide what the rules are. The purpose of it is essentially to stop you humming and hawing about small details as you write. Once again, could be very useful for the perfectionists in the group today. Now, some suggestions for things you might include in a style sheet. You could include which words should be hyphenated, the capitalization of certain words if it might be ambiguous, maybe even the formatting of certain words such as whether or not they should be italicized. Now, whenever I talk about style sheets, I always think it's a little bit abstract, and I was talking about this with my colleague Andrew yesterday, and we thought it might be helpful to give you a little bit of an example as to what a style sheet looks like. Now, this is just a small proportion of what you might include in a larger style sheet, but it should give you some ideas as to the types of things that you can include. Now, the 4 points I've got on screen are all related to the presentation of numbers or numerical information. And you can see it's really specific. You've got stuff there around how numbers should be spelt out or whether they should be in numerical form, what to do with percentages, what should be hyphenated, even where the commas go if you've got 4-digit or 5-digit numbers. So that's just an example of the types of things that might be in a style sheet. It's a really tricky thing to provide an example of, just simply because everyone's style sheet will be personal to their own research. But if you just keep in mind it's whatever rules you follow with your writing, then it should be pretty quick for you to develop something similar for yourself. Now, my previous slide also had a comment about using style guides. Now, there are lots of different style guides out there for different disciplines. Now, I'm from a psychology background, so I'm always referring to the American Psychological Association manual, which tells me everything from whether numbers should be presented as words or digits, through to how my tables and references should be formatted. So find out if there is a style guide for your own discipline, because if you follow that from the outset of your writing, it can save you a significant amount of time when you're at the revising and editing stages. As an aside, for those of you like me that are using American Psychological Association, the 7th edition of the book is now available for pre-order. I noticed Andrew ordered that a couple of days ago, so you might want to update your copy of that style guide if you're using it. Now, one of the issues that we often have with our own writing is that it's really hard to spot mistakes. And lots of people advise that you should read your work aloud. And I think that's an excellent way to find mistakes, but for me, it doesn't work at all. So what happens is, if I read my work out loud, I read it the way I think it should sound. So I actually correct the mistakes without realizing it while I'm reading out loud. So a great alternative to that is the text-to-speech function that is included in most versions of Microsoft Word. Now, there are other applications that will also enable you to read your text out loud, and if you're on a Mac, that's got a built-in text-to-speech feature. So I'm just mentioning Microsoft Word as one possibility. So the idea is that you get your computer to read the text out to you, and that allows you to quickly identify mistakes like missing words or typos. So if you're not sure how to set that up for yourself, just do a quick Google search for your version of Word and the term text-to-speech, and that should point you in the right direction. I've got to say, I was really doubtful as to how useful that would be when someone recommended it to me, but I use it all the time now, and I find it really helpful, especially if my eyes are really tired and the words are just becoming a blur on the page. It helps me pick up on a huge number of errors that I would have otherwise missed. As an aside, for those of you that do a lot of marking, I actually find it really helpful for marking assignments as well. By the time you're on your 30th assignment, the words certainly start to blur on the page. Now, just another little trick related to this for picking up on mistakes is, before you do your final read-through of your writing, make the text look really different. So change the font type, the font color, the size, the alignment, whatever you can change. And sometimes that just helps the errors look more obvious when you're reading your writing for the 20th time. That was another strategy I was quite doubtful about, but it has never failed to pay off. I've always spotted at least one error with it. So my next tip is around structure. A good piece of writing tells a story and makes a clear argument. And a really simple way to achieve this is the structure that you use throughout all levels of your writing. Every sentence needs to be clearly structured. Those sentences should form well-connected paragraphs. The paragraphs need to flow sensibly from each other, as does each section within your overall writing as well. Now, trying to discuss details around sentence and paragraph structure in a short webinar like this would be going down the rabbit holes somewhat, so I'm going to keep my tips here more general. Just in relation to paragraphs, the first sentence of every paragraph should ideally summarize the rest of the paragraph. It's actually your topic sentence. It's not always the case, but in theory, you should be able to read the first sentence of each paragraph, and the overall message of your paper or your chapter should still be clear and make sense. While it doesn't apply to all types of writing, I think it's a really good test of how good your writing is. In terms of the flow of paragraphs, each paragraph needs to flow sensibly from the previous one so that you've got a coherent argument overall. One of the very useful tricks I learned when I was completing my PhD was from a fellow student. I was part of a small writing group, and one of the members of my group was completing a PhD in English. I was always fascinated when I watched her engage with a piece of our writing, because she would print it off and she would go down the margin and she'd write a note in the margin as to what the main point of each paragraph was about. So each paragraph she'd just put 2 or 3 words that sort of conveyed what the main point was. And then she'd go through those margin notes to see if the sequencing of each paragraph made sense. Now, of course, it had another advantage in that it was a useful check to see if each paragraph contained a single idea. So I use that strategy lots now in my writing, just going through each paragraph, figuring out what the main point is, and going through and making sure that they do follow in a logical order. Now, you can apply that same logic to your headings and subheadings. So looking over your headings and subheadings is a really useful way to ensure each section flows logically. Try that again, getting my words stumbling there. I personally like to use navigation pane in Word to do that, and there were a couple of the group actually that suggested this earlier on today. So the navigation pane in Word will allow you to quickly look over your headings and subheadings, but you could also create a quick table of contents as well. Within each section, also don't forget to signpost to the reader, so giving them a heads up as to what will be covered and reminding them where they've been. So just to summarise in terms of structure, be really clear on what each section, paragraph and sentence is about. If you're not clear about how something fits the overall purpose, it probably needs to be deleted. If in doubt, throw it out is usually quite a good rule of thumb when you're revising and editing. So I've just got 2 slides left to cover, and then I'm going to quickly go through and share some of these great tips that have been coming through. Now, just because the piece of work you're writing is an academic one, it doesn't mean that it needs to be unnecessarily complex. You don't get brownie points for being hard to understand. So, a few tips here. What's your sentence length? I think when we're trying to convey complex ideas, it's easy for the length of our sentences to get a bit out of hand. My rule of thumb is if a sentence is more than 40 words, you probably want to take another look at it. I think aiming for a mix of short and long sentences in your writing is a good rule of thumb. And likewise for paragraph length, a mix of short and long paragraphs keeps your writing varied and hopefully more interesting for the reader. Another way to keep it simple is don't use big words for the sake of it, and try not overuse abbreviations and acronyms. They can cause your reader a bit of cognitive overload. Do use them to good effect, but try and avoid having a large number of them. Now, wordiness is also less than ideal and means that your writing is unnecessarily complex. Aim to make your writing as concise as possible while still conveying the main points that you need. I saw a really interesting tip recently that suggested if you struggle with wordiness, you should act like you need to pay $1 for each word that you write. not sure that would work for me personally, but I think it's quite a nice idea. One strategy that has worked for me in the past is that if I'm worried about my wordiness in a piece of writing, I give 4 to 5 pages of my writing to a colleague and I ask them to cut out any unnecessary words. What I usually find is that there's a pattern that I can learn from and I can then apply that to the rest of my writing. There's nothing like having a second pair of eyes to point those sorts of things out. Another way to reduce wordiness is making good use of the find and replace feature. So most word processors have a find and replace tool, and that's really useful for the pet words that we all like to use repetitively. Words like however, furthermore, in addition to, moreover, for example. Now I suspect you know what words you use, so I'm going to launch a very quick poll on screen just to see which of these words you tend to overuse in your writing. I'm going to make you just choose one here, so pick the word that you tend to use most often. And if you've got another word that you use over and over, pop that through to me in the question panel. All specifically's come through as a repeated word. That's an interesting one. Fab. We've got almost everyone's responded to that. Last chance to put a vote through. And I'll just close that and share it with you all. I'm not surprised by however being the most popular option there. That's certainly one that I use lots in my own writing. When I wrote the methodologies or method section, of my PhD, I found myself repeatedly using the word unfortunately. I had a few things go wrong. So unfortunately isn't the best word to be using over and over. So certainly had to get rid of that. And that's the key to those repeated pet words. You can usually just delete them from your document. So use the find and replace to quickly go through, find them and get rid of them if you can. Now I have a few other tips around wordiness on my final content slide. I am aware that there are a range of automated tools that will help you detect writing and grammar issues. Now at the end of my slides, I've got links to Grammarly and Perfectit. Now I don't use Grammarly myself and I've heard mixed views on it, but it's certainly very popular. We use Perfectit here at Academic Consulting, and I can see I've had a message through from Wendy in the group. She also recommends it as well. So in terms of automated grammar checkers, I think it's important to keep in mind that those tools play a role and they can be a really useful way to learn grammar rules. I also think, though, nothing beats having a professional proofreader look over your work. So if you have the time and the budget for it, I'd really recommend that. Just a wee plug while we're talking about proofreading, of course. Don't forget that proofreading and formatting is something we can help you with here at Academic Consulting. But also don't overlook the grammar check in Word. Most people find the grammar check functionality quite irritating, but you can actually customize it to make it more useful for your purposes. So for example, you can set it to detect contractions, which you obviously don't want in academic writing. You can check for single space versus double space between sentences, which is great if the writing you're working on is a team effort where different people might have different styles. You can even check for an Oxford comma or detect wordiness, coming back to my previous slide. So do investigate that further. Once again, if you just do a Google search for your version of Word and customize grammar check, you'll get some instructions on how to go about it. The other thing that you might like to consider is how fit or flabby your writing is. And my links at the end of the slides, there is a link to Helen Sword's Writer's Diet website. You can actually copy and paste a section of your writing into that, and it will give you an indication as to how fit or flabby your writing is. Now also at the bottom of that Writer's Diet page, there's a link to Helen's Writing Base website, which gives you a diagnostic tool to help you assess and maybe even improve your own writing practice. Helen Sword's websites and books are actually some of my favourite resources on writing. So that brings me to the various resources I wanted to mention. So these are various websites that I've either mentioned along the way or that I wanted to include. I think the only two that I haven't mentioned today are the Written Kitten and 750 Words websites. Some people like to set a goal of a certain number of words in a writing session, and they're quite useful tools to help you keep track of that. And then in terms of writing books, God, there were so many I could have put on my slides here. So I've just been a little bit specific and chosen the three by Helen Sword. But certainly there's lots of really good writing guides out there. But I really rate all three of those books. I particularly enjoyed that last one, which was around how successful academics write. Okay, folks, so that's me through content. I want to do a quick whip through of some of the tips that came through from the group. And then I'll take any questions. So I've had a comment through from Adrian saying that writing goes well for her before actually sitting down at her desk with her laptop and research notes. Begins with strategic reading, effective note-taking, and letting it all sink in at the unconscious level. I think that's a really nice point, actually. Also a tip around keeping a handwritten research journal, very helpful for when you have moments of intuition or a flash of intuition. I like to use Evernote for that personally, but I certainly kept a handwritten journal when I was doing my PhD. I found that invaluable. A few comments around how long it takes people to get into writing, and I think it's worth acknowledging a few of the group has said it takes them a good 20 minutes minimum before they get in the swing. So I think it's important not to give up too early, because otherwise you risk sort of stopping before you get into the flow. Alison has said that she loves stationery, always has a notebook in her bag, different pens and pencils handy. I am a big stationery fan myself. I've got to be careful when I go into stores like kikki.K because I end up spending far too much money. Another tip around when you're writing up data analysis, starting with a visual that sort of summarizes results and then coming up with some bullet points from that visual. I quite like that, actually. I'm a huge fan of visuals in data analysis write-ups. And I think I've mentioned all of the others as we have gone through. So I love this tip that I've got on screen at the moment. Single most useful piece of equipment for a writer is a bucket of glue. First you spread some on your chair and then you sit down. So hopefully that might be helpful for some of you. Let's just take any questions you have. If anyone needs to race off to attend another meeting, just to note that when you exit the webinar, an evaluation will appear on screen. If you had a moment to fill that out, that would be lovely. There's only about half a dozen questions. And just to note as well that I will be sending a recording out later today if you want to revise any of today's tips. I had a question come through regarding styles in Microsoft Word. If you need to format differently for different journals and the style pane reverts to whatever you last used, and the question is associated with that is should she be setting up a template? Yeah, I think having templates for different journals would be really helpful. That way you know your styles will stick. Word has a tendency to want to sort of likes to think it knows what you're thinking, which can be a little bit problematic. So it does sound like templates are a good answer to that question. A question through around chronology. So if a sentence needs to have a story or chronology, do references as well. I'm not quite sure if that question relates to the writing overall or if it's the listing for a particular citation. I think in terms of how the order you present your references, it needs to be whatever will tell a story. And sometimes that might be chronological, and other times it might not be a suitable way to present. So unfortunately, that's one of the many questions I get asked that I answer, it depends, in order to answer that. I think that is actually all the questions that have come through. If I've missed your question, do send it again just to draw my attention to it, because there was quite a lot of comments came through. So just to finish off while people are possibly typing a final question, just a little bit about academic consulting. For those of you that haven't heard of us before, we're an Auckland-based company that provide research and training services. So I often joke that we can either teach you how to do the research yourself, or if you don't have the time or resources, you can ask us to do the work for you. What that means in practical terms is if you're a student, we can assist with data analysis advice, teach you some software skills, and if you have something like a thesis to produce, we have what I call our one-stop shop, which means we do the proofreading, formatting, and reference checking. You still need to do the writing, but hopefully today's webinar will assist you with that. If you're an academic or in a more corporate setting, we can either provide advice for your project, help you get the work completed more efficiently, or you can outsource as much or as little of your project as you'd like to us. Everything from data collection through to writing up the findings, or helping you proofread and format your articles and reports. So if you're interested in any of our other services, I've just got our contact details and website on screen. Well, it doesn't look like there are any other questions coming through at this stage, but I will stay online for a few minutes in case you have a last-minute burning question. Thanks for attending this morning's webinar. It's been lovely having you all online. Do hope you found the session useful and that you're going to have a go at putting some of those tips in practice. Best wishes with your next piece of writing, and don't hesitate to get in touch if we can be of any assistance.